For many of us, it's just bubblegum for the eyes, a bit of light relief before bedtime, not to be taken too seriously. For others, it's a remarkable phenomenon that's revolutionizing the way we perceive and interact with the world in which we live. We're talking about, of course, about the television. Love it or hate it, patronize it or praise it, it's impossible to get away from it, like now, for example. Many of us have grown up with television. We've taken it in with our mother's milk. Fewer and fewer of us, it seems, have any memory of life before it. In this series of programmes, we're trying to get beneath the surface of our society, to take its spiritual pulse, as it were, to read the writing on the walls that surround us. Many people would argue that television is in fact one of the fundamental signs of our times. It brings all of the other signs to us, enabling us to see them close up, establish intimate contact with them, make them our own. It's our window onto the world, and more troublingly perhaps, it's also the world's window onto us.
I can remember when we got our first television set, and it came in a big brown box, and a truck delivered it to the front door, and we unpacked it, a little town out in the middle of western Nebraska, opened it up, turned it on, and it didn't work right away, but when we finally got the aerial we needed, then we got all kinds of magic pictures and music and images that we'd never had access to before. It was really wonderful.
Stuart Hoover is a professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication in the University of Colorado at Boulder.
Trying to top cable TV for pure variety is a pretty tall order.
Television is the most common experience in American life. It's the one thing that weaves us all together. It's the one thing that we all share. What you can travel from New York to Los Angeles and expect to be able to talk to someone in Los Angeles about an experience you had in New York last night that they also had. And that's an experience that you both had via television. Television's pervasiveness is unprecedented. There has never been an instrument in the history of humankind that has had the ability to bring simultaneous messages and images to a whole people, and television is able to do that. Its pervasiveness in the American home is also unprecedented. You know, those boxes are in 98% of American homes. It has essentially achieved saturation level. And that means, I think, in a fundamental way, that it's become the hearth for us. It's become the campfire around which people gather to hear the stories and narratives and symbols and ideas that tell us who we are at this point in history. And it's the central source of information as well. It's the place where most people get most of their news. More people get their news from television than from newspapers. It really is that single most important source of information and source of insight and source of input into the American home and into American individual life.
But what kind of influence does television have in our homes? Dr. Bill Four is the author of a recent book called Mythmakers: Gospel, Culture and the Media.
Every society has to have a culture to keep it together, to hold it together, the glue that holds society together, that tells people who they are as a people. And to do that, every culture has used storytelling. Storytelling is the key to it. Every culture has had its storytellers. The Greeks had their plays, the Middle Ages had their morality plays. In the 18th century, we had the weekly magazines, and people like Charles Dickens and Edgar Allan Poe were the storytellers. And in this century, until about 1950, those slick magazines like Life magazine. That Life magazine was our chronicler, our storyteller. And then suddenly came the greatest storyteller of all time, television, which is pouring out day after day and year after year our image of ourselves. It resonates our mythology, our worldview. Since television is the great storyteller, it also has become automatically the great maker of myths. By myths, I mean those underlying fundamental assumptions that people never even think about, that they take for granted, like asking a fish to think about the water he's swimming in. He doesn't think about it. We don't think about those fundamental myths, and yet television resonates those out to us constantly, all the time. Just to give you a few examples, there are 3 or 4 myths that come to mind, and I'm sure you can think of many others. But one is that the fittest survive. Now, this doesn't mean that the fittest do survive, but that they should survive, you see. And who are the fittest in television land? Well, they are young, they are white, they are male. Now, if you happen not to fit those three categories, all three of those categories, television is telling you constantly, you're not quite as fit. Don't expect to own, to control, to have the power, to be yourself, because you are not as worthy as the fittest who should survive. That's a terrible myth.
I'm a certified physical fitness specialist. I'm the fitness expert for the Home Shopping Network with over 6 platinum video awards, 6 gold video awards, over 1.5 million members, and I guarantee you results.
So, head for the mountains. Because once a mountain man has his mountains, what more could he possibly want?
A second myth is that power starts at the center and moves out. Now, you get this everywhere. The Wall Street Week, you know the power's in Wall Street. You know that the political power is from Washington. Even the entertainment power, you have something Hollywood entertainment. There's always a center moving out. Television itself is like a giant network moving from the center out. So is cable. In this country, we have quite a different tradition of power. We say that power should come from the consent of the governed. That is, the governed should decide who should have the power. Television tells us just the opposite. Don't worry, everything is under control by a few people in business, few people in industry, few people in the television business, few people in government. They control things. That's the way it should be. A third one, an interesting myth, is that progress is an inherent good. That is to say, anything that is new is better than anything that's old. Everything should move forward. If you can do it, you should do it. If you can build a supersonic transport that can carry 50 wealthy men across the ocean in 2.5 hours at enormous cost to the environment and enormous cost to the oil depletion and all the rest, and to this country which subsidizes this, then you should do it. If you can do it, you should do it. The questions of human accountability of does it meet human needs is not asked, and television constantly impresses upon us that progress is inevitable, and everything has to be new, and everything has to move, quote, forward.
It's capable of extrasensory communication. It contains platinum, rhodium, and newly formed materials.
When the rest say you can't, Canon says you can. Canon. Now you can.
A fourth one is, of course, that consumption equals happiness. Happiness consists of having things. You are what you own. And of course that means you should own everything and you should use it up and you should throw it away. And that happiness consists of the limitless acquisition of material goods. You are what you own.
DCBY Sundays on sale? I really love that.
It doesn't take a professional theologian to realize that those 4 assumptions, and those are just 4 of maybe 24, are almost diametrically opposed to a Christian understanding of the way the world should be. Compassion instead of control, putting emphasis on the community instead of on the power center of a leader, being concerned for what a person really is instead of for what a person has. There's an enormous disjunction between clear biblical, both Old and New Testament, and certainly Christian viewpoint, worldview, and this worldview of the technological era of which television is the primary spokesperson.
Television is particularly troublesome, I think, because it's in the home. It's right there. Unlike other kind of cultural forces, other voices that are in the society and in the culture. Television is right there. And I think people are quite rightly more concerned about television because of its position in the home than they might be about books or other types of speech or other systems of communication and of language. And it's a fact that as you look at television and begin to understand television on a variety of levels, you begin to understand the extent to which television has its own set of values, its own set of logics, its own vision of the good, its own vision of right, its own version of truth. And those visions and versions largely rise out of or grow out of a logic that's very much different from the gospel logic. I think their orientation on television is much more toward utility, for instance. You'll find that the solutions that are embedded in the dramas on television have to do with a focus on ends that justify the means to achieve those ends, whereas often the Christian message is a different message than that. I think that the television tends not to focus on the whole person. It focuses on ephemera and on image. It tends to equate material goods with satisfaction of ultimate value, and these are all ways in which television is at some variance from our understanding of gospel values. I don't know that there's a way for that not to happen. Television's embedded in the commodity culture. It's embedded in the corporate structure and process of marketing of symbols and images. It's embedded in advertising. And so it's going to necessarily focus on limited and very kind of compartmentalized and particularized views of human life and human prospects. And I'm not sure that there's any way that can be avoided. I think the solution for Christians is to be critical consumers of the material that they see on television.
So according to Stuart Hoover, it's the most common experience in American life. According to Bill Ford, it's the great mythmaker, the great storyteller of our times. Well, with me to discuss the role of television in our lives are two colleagues here at Columbia Seminary. Rebecca Parker is Director of Continuing Education, and Chuck Campbell is Professor of Worship and Preaching. As well as being interested in the big social and religious issues relating to the role of television, both of them have small children, and I think that concentrates the mind wonderfully in any discussion of the role of the magic box in our lives. Rebecca Parker, do you actually like television? And do you enjoy watching?
I think I have an ambivalent relationship to the television. There are parts of it that I enjoy, I think because I can check out. It's a way to relax and still take in information. And then on the other hand, I think it does take energy away from my family and from my child. So it is an ambivalent relationship I think I have.
What about your child? I mean, how do you control what she watches, or do you do that at all?
I am more and more aware of it. She is only 3½, and it wasn't until 6 months ago that she discovered the television. But what I watched was her become mesmerized by the television, and everything that I had read about the way children respond to television, I'm seeing to be true. At 3½, she can sit and stare at the television for an hour, to an hour and a half. And that's frightening to me. At first it was great news because it meant that I could get my makeup on or get ready to go somewhere, and I knew I could put her to the side. But the more that I watched myself use that, the more concerned I have become and have put limits on it. But I find myself exploring that relationship and sorting out what my responsibility is.
Chuck Campbell, how about you? What sort of things do you like to watch?
I don't watch a lot of television, but I do enjoy primarily news shows and sports programming from time to time. There's not really a single individual show that I watch regularly. Like Rebecca with the children, it is a challenge. The frustration for us with the children has been even when we're trying to control the programs they're watching, the advertisements will come on with extraordinary violence and extraordinarily explicit and sexual innuendo. So it's like you can't escape from that even on the so-called good children's shows at the proper hour of the day. It's remarkable. That's the thing that makes me the angriest, I think, are when those kinds of little blips come into even the shows that you have cleared for the children.
What do you think, Chuck, of this idea of television as the great storyteller? I mean, do you agree with that?
I would take issue with some of the things that they were saying. First of all, I don't think there's any question that there are certain myths which have been discussed earlier which television perpetuates. A couple of the issues that I would raise, I'm not sure that we can look at television and see any single coherent narrative, any single coherent story that is being told, particularly with the fragmentation of the channels and people queuing in more specifically to certain kinds of programming and certain kinds of channels. So I think what would be interesting is to look at the stories, plural, that are being told through television and the fragmentation there. The other thing is I'm wondering as we move increasingly to shows like MTV, and as that has had an influence on television and advertising, if really we can talk about stories or coherent narratives at all, or if we're not moving to a kind of fragmentation of images and a much more fragmented understanding of what's going on, rather than speaking of television telling one grand story. I'm sort of suspicious of that.
And yet, if you take the role of commercials in television, on network television, you're never more than 6 or 7 minutes away from a commercial. Those are the kind of underlying thing that holds the station together. You keep returning to those commercials, whatever the program. Right. Don't you think there's a way in which they provide the big story? The
commercials probably do provide maybe the thread of the narrative, if you want to put it that way, that is fairly consistent, particularly in relation to the consumerism of the society and the commodity, the commodification of our society. But what's fascinating there, though, is frequently those commercials will come in juxtaposed against news that may be very tragic or may be very serious, and that's where you get this incredible kind of fragmentation. What's going on there? Where is the narrative? As you hear a serious report about some situation somewhere in the world, and then the next minute there's an advertisement for chapstick. I mean, that's what I'm talking about, the kind of fragmentation. Where is the narrative? What's the real story? What kinds of stories are being told? And I think it's that fragmentation, that tension, that is just as interesting as the sense of a single story or a single coherent narrative being told.
Rebecca, what do you make of this idea of the story, the big story of television?
Well, I'm interested in what Chuck is saying about it. It's partly that when you have that many stories going at once, it flattens any story. So that there's not emotional power in the story that's being told, from whether you're watching news or whether it goes to commercials. But I do think that there is a larger theme that runs underneath. And it is one that has a numbing effect on us as a culture in terms of what our values are. Or another way to look at it is that it presents us with values that are not intentional. I think there's two languages going on. Maybe that's a better way to say it. That there is a language and a spoken word to our unconscious, which many of us do not take seriously and do not listen to. Therefore, we don't know we're being programmed. And then there's the conscious message coming in, where we can tell you back what's being said to us. But I think the far more powerful piece that we don't pay attention to are the unconscious symbols, and the overall lack of value that's being communicated to us.
How do we go about, as Christian people, beginning to tell our own story? I think that if it's true that television does, in some sense, provide a kind of a competitive source of stories and information coming into our home, things that we can't control in many ways. How does one go about beginning to structure one's own life according to a different story, the Christian story? Chuck?
Well, the first thing we're going to have to do is learn that story. I think one of the difficulties in the church today is many of us don't even know that story anymore, even in its broadest strokes. And how we go about learning that may be a piece of what you're talking about. I'm not exactly sure at this point where the media fits into that. I think to some degree we as Christians are going to have to relearn that story in smaller, more local communities first. Even oral kinds of sharing in ways that I'm not sure the mass media is going to be the best vehicle for. Obviously, the mass media, television, can reach out to people, but as far as the church beginning to relearn its own story, I believe that's probably going to happen in smaller communities and smaller, more localized communities, sharing that story together far more than we do now. The interesting thing to me is how much time we may spend with television and then how much time we may spend with our own story. We may go to church 1 hour a week and pray a little bit here and there, read the Bible from time to time, but television is there much more thoroughly than that often.
If it's the case that the challenge of television is very much at the level of our homes, it's there, you know, right in the places where we live, we can't possibly respond to it simply on the level of what happens at church once a week. Or, I mean, how do we go about responding to it at the level of our home, do you think?
As I mentioned earlier, it seems to me that one of the places where we're going to need to relearn our story and to pass on that story is in more localized communities, even more localized communities than our congregations, in our large congregations. The early church, as you know, functioned within households, which were very fairly small, localized communities that were worshiping and sharing the story. The Jewish community in the Old Testament has been very good about taking the daily activities of life, of the family, and of that extended community, and somehow using those daily activities day in and day out, week in and week out, to remember that story, to share that story. And it seems to me that it's that kind of those kinds of small, localized efforts that are going to be much more important for the church in the future than any grand scale dissemination of the gospel through the media. I think these things are going to have to come first, or maybe at least in conjunction with those others.
Rebecca?
I would agree, and it comes out of my experience with a small Sunday school class I've been working with for over 6 years now. And what I have watched is a group of people re-own morning prayer, prayer in a community, to discover a place where they can share who they are and what they value, that they can bring their celebrations and their failures to a group of Christians to pray over and to cry over, and to do that in the context of Bible study and being together. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it happen. We've also developed their Christian rituals, lighting candles and being present to one another. And what I have found is that those rituals that are ours, that come from the early church, from meeting in homes, meet a need that people have to structure their lives. And when they have something that is as powerful to counterbalance television, it will take its place, and it fills a need. It's a small project. I mean, it's hard to say that you do it in small groups and small settings, and then once it's there, I've watched the mothers and fathers move it into their homes, so that Christmas is celebrated differently now, so that Easter is celebrated differently now, because they have a different sense of what it means to be Christian and a different space to fill that can move television to the side.
Both of you have been fairly negative in a way, what you've said about television, and fairly concerned. There's a British writer called Malcolm Muggeridge who wrote, he died a year or two ago, but wrote a lot about modern culture and Christian faith. But he was very concerned about television, despite the fact that he'd made his name in television as a writer and broadcaster. But he came to the conclusion in the end that television was a lost cause. That what we really need to do is to, as he said, have our aerials removed. And he got rid of the television from his own home. Would you go that far? I mean, do we need to have our aerials removed? Chuck? I
don't think I would go that far. I see television and the whole media question as a part of this creation, and it may be rebelling in some ways against what Christians would understand to be the ways of God and the values of the Christian faith. But I don't think it's irredeemable. I think we have to be very honest about the limits. We have to be very honest about its power, honest about the issues. And I would probably be more on the side of the iconoclast in that sense than using it all the time positively. But I don't think the answer is simply to stick our heads in the sand and pull out our aerials. We're using television today. Sort of an irony of this show that we're talking about television while we're trying to use television as a medium to talk about television. I haven't figured that one out yet. So obviously I wouldn't even be here today if I thought all we should do is pull out our aerials and have nothing to do with it.
All right, that's good to hear. Rebecca, how about you?
Oh, I would agree. If you pull out your aerials, you make television the problem, or you make it into, the monster. And I don't think that it is. For me, it goes back to Christians knowing their story and knowing what we're grounded in and recreating, or not recreating, but re-owning the liturgy of the church and the rituals that are ours, so that we know who we are and we have a counterbalance to that, so that we choose television when we need it. But an emptiness, a lack of understanding, we fill back in with the drama that has been ours since the early church. It's there for us to own.
Well, my thanks to Rebecca Parker and Chuck Campbell. Perhaps the conclusion, if any, that we can draw from this discussion is that instead of having our aerials removed, what we need to do is to tune them more finely, to be more critical about what we see and what we hear, and to have eyes that really do see and ears that do hear and minds that understand what is going on in our world. Our next program, we're going to be discussing what might be called the great American substitute for legs, the car. I hope you can join us then. But until then, from all of us here at Columbia Theological Seminary, goodbye.